G'day, I'm Alex Bainbridge. Welcome to the Green F Show. To cut military spending and cancel AUKUS, or to increase military spending and prepare for more involvement in imperialist wars. That's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get underway, I do want to acknowledge that this show is recorded on stolen First Nations land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Also, if you like the work that we do, please do become a Green F supporter. It is the number one way to support our work and also to get the content that we produce. Plans start from just $5 a month. You can find out more at the Green F website or at the link in the video description or podcast description, wherever you're getting this episode of the Green F Show. Now, last night in the budget, Treasurer Jim Chalmers confirmed that Australia is on a pathway towards massively increasing military expenditure, even though we face no credible military threats. This is also in a context where the genocide in Gaza, in which Australia is definitely very complicit, shapes the framework of the world that we're moving into. We're living in a world where the big imperialist powers are more and more asserting that might makes right, and they will do whatever they want to get what they want. Now, I'm here with Sam Wainwright. Sam is a national co-convenor of the Socialist Alliance, and he's a former elected representative on the Fremantle City Council. He's also actively involved in Stop AUKUS WA. Now, I began by asking Sam to explain why the Socialist Alliance is taking to this election a policy of cutting military expenditure at least by half, whereas the Labor government is going in exactly the opposite direction. Sam, can you just explain to us why you're taking this stand?
Yes, as you say, the position of Socialist Alliance is actually to cut military spending by 50%. Now, on one level, that's a bit arbitrary. I mean, why not cut it by 45% or 60% or something else? But it's a way of us wanting to dramatise the fact, two things. First is that money that has been put towards the military could and should be used for much more pressing, immediate social and environmental problems that need to be addressed. But secondly, and more generally, it dramatises the fact that Australia as a country needs to head in a fundamentally different direction. We've got a government and an opposition, and much of the media are telling us that Australia needs to gear up for a new Cold War and possibly even a new hot war because we face some existential threat, military threat, which is just not borne out by the facts. And when pressed, they can't substantiate it. Nonetheless, they are trying to gear us up for a war, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, with China. And it's all about a supposed need to block China's further economic, political development in the world. And that is, frankly, that is insane. I mean, that is utterly crazy. That threatens, the wars we've seen in Sudan and Ukraine are terrible enough. But the idea that Australia would be allying with the United States to try and to block by force China's economic growth and risk a world war is utterly ludicrous. It's grotesque and antisocial in the most profound sense. Now, of course, as a society, we do face an existential threat to our existence, and that's runaway global warming. The whole of humanity faces that threat, and that's the emergency we need to be mobilising for. And one of the things that we are trying to do in Socialist Alliance through our election campaign and more generally is to say, well, yes, we face a choice. It's a fork in a road. You can either respond to the threat posed by runaway global warming by engaging in a war for resources and gearing up for a war with China or the rest of the world, presumably to try and grab for ourselves drinking water and arable land and that kind of thing, or we can mobilise to confront global warming in a constructive way based on the vision of peace and justice in the world. And of course, the latter is what we're advocating, and so we need to completely shake up all this discussion about defence and security and ask what is really essential to our security.
Now, you have long spoken out against AUKUS, but this year in February, the Australian government took $800 million handed over to the US government as a supposed down payment for nuclear submarines. And this is in a context where Donald Trump didn't even seem to know what AUKUS was. Is the Australian government being played for fools?
Well, I think they are being played for fools, but it also bears out just how totally ideologically committed a dominant section of the ruling elite in Australia is, how committed they are, how ideologically committed they've become to this US push to contain China as being some sort of necessary imperative. Of course, not all people in the establishment or elite decision-making circles advocate that path. So notable exceptions, of course, are Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull, who, they're essentially saying, well, Australia's a mid-sized power in the Asia Pacific. It could, it doesn't have to choose between the United States and China. It can just trade and be friends with both and just make up its mind as it goes along, kind of thing, which frankly is true. I mean, that doesn't mean to say I have the same position or us in Socialist Alliance have the same position as Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, they want Australia to have an independent, but I would say pro-capitalist foreign policy and so-called defence policy, whereas I would say we need to go much further than that. In fact, we need to have an independent foreign policy based on peace and justice in the world. But that's not even in the realm of comprehension of the front bench of the Labor Party and Liberal Party and the whole sort of that section of the decision-making elite ruling class that has locked in behind AUKUS and the whole AUKUS project. And they're so locked in behind it, they can't even, even when we have the statements by Trump, as you said, not even knowing what AUKUS is. And also, I mean, this so-called down payment, it's untied and non-refundable. Supposedly it's a contribution by Australia to the US shipbuilding industry to boost its capacity, to guarantee that we get some of the Virginia class submarines before the AUKUS class submarines arrive in the distant future. But no, the irony of the situation is that Trump, I mean, there's already been, even before this was agreed to, there was some dissension in ruling circles in the United States about whether the United States had the capacity, to let Australia have some of these Virginia class submarines. So there's every possibility that Trump will just decide to keep the money and not give us the submarines anyway. Now, I don't want us to have the submarines. I don't want nuclear armed, let alone powered submarines anywhere near Australian shores. But yes, there's every chance that Trump will do that. Even then, I don't even that sort of humiliating betrayal, I don't think would be enough to make our leaders change course. They're so fixated on this on this direction.
I want to ask you about what you make of Trump's wild claims or wild intentions to claim at least Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. How does this impact the campaign against AUKUS in Australia?
I think just first a general observation, or a couple of general observations on the sort of the stuff that comes out of Trump's mouth. I can't remember who it was, but I heard someone say recently, the thing about Trump is you don't necessarily have to take him literally, but you have to take him seriously. And it does seem to be Trump's practice is just to say out loud the ambit claim of the United States and to put it out there and then see where things fall, So it's unvarnished. And in that sense, Trump is kind of shocking because he just explicitly articulates a vision for US power, the naked US imperial power, and he feels no need to cloak it in verbiage about rules-based order, peace and prosperity, all this sort of stuff. I mean, in fact, he comes from a section of the US ruling elite that has basically decided the United States, it's actually a hindrance for the United States to feel like it has to sort of prop up or maintain, both ideologically and financially, multilateral institutions like the United Nations or NATO, that sort of stuff. And the United States should just be blunt and transactional about its purposes. And so his rhetoric then flows from that. But the thing I would stress, though, is we shouldn't, even though Trump does represent something that is new and dangerous, and we shouldn't downplay that, we shouldn't bend the stick the other way and forget that, the smooth talking, superficially woke Western European or Democrat or Labor Party politicians in Australia still fundamentally have the same vision of the world in which the rich and powerful nations dominate the world and exploit it economically. So in the case of something like Greenland, I mean, bear in mind the United States has already got a number of bases on Greenland, and of course, if Joe Biden wanted to increase the US presence on Greenland, He would have done it differently to Trump. Yes, he wouldn't have just blurted out, you've got it, we want it, we're going to take it. No, he would have, there would have been, lots of overwrought verbiage about, partnering with Denmark and NATO to secure mutual prosperity and freedom of navigation in the North Atlantic and across the Arctic and all this sort of stuff. And he would have gently reminded Denmark that the United States would be ready to step in and partner Greenland's path to independence if Denmark didn't play ball. And he would have wrapped it all up with a visit to an indigenous cultural center in Greenland. That's the way the Democrats do their imperialism. And Trump just does it more bluntly. But I think that's the in one level, I suppose you could say that Trump has done us a service, because he just says out loud what the ruling elite are thinking.
So having a wild and erratic Trump in the White House, how much is this just an extra case to oppose AUKUS? I mean, does the case against AUKUS stand on its own?
I think the case against AUKUS, I think the case on AUKUS stands on its own. So I think, if you like, it's Trump's naked aggression illustrates why AUKUS is such a bad idea. But it was bad before Trump turned up. I mean, let's just take things back to where we were before. The United States asserting against all, not just international law, but moral principle, that somehow it has the right to block by force of arms, if necessary, the further growth of China, and to risk a global, nuclear war. I mean, that's what AUKUS is, and so the fact that we now have someone who's just so nakedly aggressive as Trump at the helm just simply serves to illustrate the problem of AUKUS. I mean, it does. For those of us who are campaigning against AUKUS, of course, it makes it easier it does make it easier to make the case. But we should never lull ourselves into thinking that the AUKUS was okay before.
Now, the Greens have recently announced a policy to repurpose $4 billion of military spending towards domestic production of missiles and military drone technology. What do you make of this new policy and the messaging around it?
Look, to be frank, I think it's a bit confused. I mean, the Greens have come out against AUKUS, which is good, and I'm not sure whether they've explicitly come out against other pillars of Australia's military alliance with the United States, such as ANZUS. But unequivocally opposing AUKUS, of course, is a very good thing, and it's the right direction. But there's some ambiguity about the Greens' policy, because it's not clear whether, there's a few things. In the first instance, they're saying, let's take the money that was going to be spent on AUKUS and spend it instead on genuinely defensive armaments spending. And of course, you could sort of tie yourself in knots sort of debating exactly what that kind of constitutes. And it's made especially complicated by the fact that, of course, all military spending is described as defence nowadays. I mean, it's not. I mean, if you look at the last 120 years of Australian existence, apart from World War II, pretty much every theatre of war Australia has been involved in has been offensive, not defensive. It's had nothing to do with defending Australia from any real threat, and particularly since, in the first, generally as a junior partner, first to the British Empire, and since the Second World War, as a partner to the US Empire. But it's been part of a fabric, a policy of, to be blunt, maintaining a violent subjugation of the people of the global South and the economic exploitation of the global South. Number one, and number two, joining the United States in campaigns against any states that it regards as being its enemies. That's been Australia's so-called defence policy. So even the word defence is a misnomer. I try to avoid using the word defence and defence spending. So I think that's part of the problem. That's a risk that the Greens take as well. Is they say, oh yes, we need defence spending, but it needs to be on something else. Now, I don't say that as a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I think there are circumstances where just like as an individual, you have a right to use as much force as is necessary to defend yourself from attack. Well, so do groups of people. But in a context where we've been told, oh, there's this urgent, pressing threat, we need defence spending. the Greens do risk buying into that and validating that by saying, oh, yes, we need this defence spending, but it just needs to be somewhere else. Because it's not clear whether the Greens are saying we actually need to cut overall so-called defence spending. And, when we start talking about, what should our so-called defence spending be, or what equipment should we be spending it on, if you spend too much time thinking about that in the current circumstance, you neglect the higher order question, which is what actual purpose does Australian military policy serve? Does it serve the interests of creating a democratic and peaceful world based on peace and justice, or is it based on systematic exploitation of people of the global South and going after any state that the United States regards as its enemy? Well, I think, that's a rhetorical question. We know that. And so that's the discussion, that's the debate we actually need to be having with the Australian people. Now, as I said at the very outset, we've in Socialist Alliance, we've gone for, if you like, an arbitrary cut defence spending by 50% as well. You could say, well, why not 60% or 70%, but it very clearly points in the direction that we need to be going. And the Greens' latest announcement doesn't do that. And I fear that it's born out of a desire to, on the one hand, stick with our policy of opposing AUKUS, but still turn to the Australian people and say, oh, but we haven't neglected our defence needs. We're still conscious of our need for defence, and we could play a responsible role in government, with a Labor minority. Because I think, we really need to engage Australians in those broader questions about, what kind of foreign policy do we actually have, and what kind of foreign policy do we need to create a better world?
Some people might think that it's a utopian pipe dream to cancel AUKUS and to disentangle from the US military. Is it actually a practical possibility for Australia today to break with AUKUS, break with the US alliance, and adopt a genuinely anti-imperialist foreign policy?
In a technical sense, it's entirely possible. And, as I said before, I mean, there's even a kind of a pro-capitalist, Australia's place in Asia vision of such a thing that's articulated by Paul Keating and by Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, one thing I'm genuinely curious about.
But they're not talking about breaking the US alliance. None of them are talking about breaking the US.
No, you're right. They're not talking about breaking the US alliance as such. But they do sort of talk more in terms of, Australia not having to choose between, China and the United States. The two things aren't counterposed. Of course, the dilemma for the Australian ruling elite is the United States has said to Australia, you do have to choose. And I think it's just so, I won't pretend to really know exactly what the thinking is inside the Australian ruling elite, especially given the particular contradiction Australia faces, given that China is our largest trading partner. It's both the largest source of our exports and imports. So to join a US campaign to throttle China is just fraught with contradictions, and you see this contradiction is borne out by the fact that the Australian ruling elite, the Labor and Liberal politicians, and want to have it both ways. They sort of want to be able to go along with the whole US war drive, but still not face any consequences or tariffs from China. I mean, it's complete. What sort of fantasy land do these people live in? I don't know. But what I think it is possible for us to break from both the dynamic of AUKUS and the whole ANZUS-US alliance more generally. But I don't, because the Australian ruling elite are so embedded in it. It's going to take a people's movement. It's going to take an earthquake in Australian politics to break from that and change direction. As I said, this economically, technically, there's absolutely no reason it can't happen. It doesn't pose any existential threat to Australia's well-being to do so. Quite the opposite. But then, the people who rule Australia inflict lots of existential threats to our well-being. That's their job. And for those of us who believe in a world that puts people and living in peace with the planet ahead of private profits, that's always been the struggle we have. So it's just like confronting the Australian state's commitment to expanding fossil fuel exploitation is going to require just an earthquake, a people's power movement on a scale we've never seen. So is breaking the US alliance, and the two things are actually linked. We're not going to be. It's a total fantasy to think that we're going to be able to confront the climate challenge while going down this path of gearing up for a Cold War. It's a total fantasy to think that we can confront the challenge of runaway global warming while continuing to aid and abet apocalyptic genocidal violence that Israel's inflicting on Gaza. They're two stark choices, two directions that we as Australian people need to choose, and I know which one I prefer.
Thank you very much for your time, Sam. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Green F Show. We'd love to have your company. We will be back again. Before we do go, I just wanted to say again that if you like the work that we do, please do become a Green F supporter if you're not already. You can also help us out just by sharing this video or sharing this podcast. Get the word around, give it a thumbs up. Help us to build the audience for the Green F Show. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you next time.